In this video, I'm going to take a comprehensive look at video game leaks. I'm going to talk you through the different types of video game leaks and weigh up the negatives and positives of them. I'll be using examples to help guide us through the video, and by the end of it you should have everything you need to make up your own mind on whether they would be considered overall a good or bad thing. So if you're sitting comfortably, my name is Jowie and this is a comprehensive look into video game leaks. There are three main types of video game leak, which of course all come with their own varying levels of morality and consequence, as well as level of legality depending on how the leak was published or acquired. Let's start off with hacking. This is probably what most people think of when you first mention a video game leak. Somebody finding their way through the code or some kind of back-end breach, ultimately breaking their way into the developer's systems and stealing data that was far from publicly available. Probably the most notable example of this would be the Nintendo leaks, which took place over a series of events spanning about 2.5 years. It started out relatively small in 2018 when users on 4chan leaked some old IQ ROM files as well as a few early Pokemon designs. It then got a lot bigger and more serious in May of 2020 when source code from a few of Nintendo's consoles started to appear online, again mainly on 4chan. This then kickstarted an absolutely gigantic leak a few months later in July, in which several gigabytes of data relating to the SNES and N64 consoles were posted online. This event inspired the leaks to be named the Nintendo Giga Leaks. Some of the most notable things included in this particular leak were old prototypes of Star Fox 1 and 2, as well as a lot of personal information and data relating to a large selection of Nintendo's developers. There was then a whole series of leaks over the course of 2020, resulting in 10 individual leaks in total, including source code, prototypes and internal data for multiple consoles, as well as a huge arsenal of video game data, prototype builds, early ROMs and even unreleased games such as Pokemon Picross for the Game Boy Color, a game which was set to release in 1999, however was cancelled before release date due to the sheer level of Pokemon games which were coming out and the shortage on cartridges. At this point I could probably make an individual video just about these leaks, and maybe I will someday, but this is an example of probably one of the most notable leaks that was the result of somebody hacking into the systems and stealing data, with 13 consoles and 49 video games affected by the leak. Now, hacking as a leak is extremely intentional and only done by those with a strong desire to get access to data. However, sometimes it could be the complete opposite, instead being down to a simple mistake made by one or more of the development team. In November of 2011, BioWare was hosting a closed beta test of Mass Effect 3 on Xbox Live. However, in the build that was being tested, they accidentally included files which contained major plot points for the game, which ended up on the Xbox Live marketplace. The files even included information about the various endings as well as some storylines that weren't quite finalized. All of this information, however, was enough for fans to get a pretty good outline on how the single player mode was going to unfold, and meant that the discussion about the game's direction had already begun long before the game's release. Not to mention the fact that it kind of outright spoilt the game for a lot of people. Even if you tried to avoid it, there was so much discussion that it was basically impossible to hide from it. BioWare did acknowledge what had happened and tried to pad it down by stating it was an early draft of the game and that people should take it with a pinch of salt. There were a few changes made by the game's release, however it's impossible to tell whether this was influenced by feedback and discussions based around the leak. This is something I will talk about later on in the video. The third and final form of video game leak that I'm going to mention is almost a middle point between the previous two. It's not unheard of for somebody inside of the development chain somewhere to secretly let information out, usually relating to upcoming releases. There could be a few different motivations for this. For example, a big one could be bribery from external sources. Now, a real world example of this isn't necessarily from a video game per se, however in 2019, Nvidia suffered a leak that exposed confidential information about upcoming GPU specifications. This information was leaked specifically to tech journalists, and so it was heavily speculated to have come from an Nvidia employee who was given a sum of cash for exclusive information. An internal investigation was launched, the results of which weren't publicly released, however they did allegedly implement stricter measures to stop something like this happening again. Another reason that an insider may want to leak information, although quite rare, would be dissatisfaction with the conditions in which they are working. The video game industry is all centered around deadlines, and so it's quite common for a development team to be put under huge pressure as the game's release date creeps closer and closer, often referred to as crunch time. In April of 2020, The Last of Us Part 2 had some fairly significant information leaked relating to cutscenes, unfinished gameplay and some pretty major plot points. The rumour was that an employee at Naughty Dog was upset about the working conditions that he was being put under, as Naughty Dog are pretty well known for having a relatively intense crunch culture. There were also rumours that a decent proportion of the employees disagreed with the story direction, and as such there was a divide between the lower development team and the leadership team. I must clarify that it was never confirmed that the leak did come from one specifically disgruntled employee, and Sony did try to pass it off as a data breach. However, many fans and even a selection of insiders have given a strong speculation that this was just a cover-up. Now that we've looked at a few different examples of varying types of video game leaks, let's weigh up their negative and positive impacts, looking at it from both the consumer and developer's point of view. We'll start with the potential positive impacts of video game leaks. Firstly, it could be considered that leaks can aid in boosting the hype around a video game, especially if the leaked gameplay or information looks particularly good and promising. It can lead to extensive fan discussions, videos, and general chat about the game, which might help in reaching out to a slightly larger audience than before. This feeds directly into my second thought for a positive impact, which is that it can help build audience engagement and help to get the game onto things like trending lists. For example, every time that something allegedly gets leaked about GTA 6, there is instantly a buzz of curiosity within the fanbase, which leads inevitably to countless discussions, speculations, videos, etc, all relating to GTA 6. This keeps the hype and awareness of the game at the forefront even when it's over a year since the trailer for the game was released. Now, with a game like GTA 6, you could argue that it doesn't really need the engagement, as it's arguably going to be the biggest video game release of 2025, so it's not like most people haven't already heard about it. However, imagine a much smaller title with only a small cult following had some details or gameplay leaked. This could start a discussion that brings in more traction or engagement from people who might not have even heard of the game, who may see, for example, some leaked gameplay and find themselves interested in the game, in return bringing a slightly larger player base to the game than before the leak. Before Cuphead's release in 2017, some screenshots of its unique art style and almost hand-drawn feel were shared around on various forums online. Seeing the unique style without seeing any gameplay for context was extremely intriguing for a lot of people, and so it sparked a huge level of hype for the game. This really helped to give Studio MDHR an initial boost before their own marketing campaign had even begun. My final thought for a positive impact could also be considered a negative impact depending on which way you think about it. I'll explain why very shortly, but for now let's look at it as a positive. Video game leaks can potentially lead to feedback and discussion that directly affects the developers and results in changes being made to the game before release which otherwise wouldn't have even been made. For an example of this, let's take a look at Star Wars Battlefront 2. While the game was in beta, information relating to the game's progression and loot box system were data mined and ultimately leaked online. It exposed a system that was going to be heavily reliant on microtransactions, with a clear advantage for those who forked out money on the game, thus being dubbed as a pay-to-win system. There was of course immediate backlash for this within the fan community, and as a consequence, EA completely reworked the progression system to remove some of the pay-to-win elements such as a lower dependency on loot boxes to get certain items in the game, instead making them more accessible by grinding the game out rather than paying for them. I would argue that this was a positive impact of leaked information for the consumer, as it stops a greedy video game company from exploiting a microtransaction system. However, on the flip side, it would be considered a negative impact for EA, as it was bad press and also meant more of the development time was eaten up having to change the system they had already built. But overall, I would say this leak had a positive impact, as the backlash was because of their own immoral idea. Moving on now then to the potential negative impacts of video game leaks. First of all, leaks can heavily impact the surprise element of a video game. Take the example I gave earlier about Mass Effect 3, when they accidentally left vital information about the game's story in files uploaded to the Xbox Marketplace. This resulted in huge spoilers and ruined the surprise of the game's direction and endings for a lot of people. Even if they were just browsing the discussion boards, it was almost impossible to escape the absolutely massive spoilers that were released. You know what else is massive? The disappointment that the developers and story writers must have felt when they saw that the hard work they had put in had suddenly been revealed for everyone to see long before the game's release. I can only imagine how deflating it must have felt, as they would most likely have had a plan when it comes to what information would be released at specific times in things like teasers and trailers leading up to the release, in order to build the tension and spark interesting speculative discussions into the story of the game. However, they didn't get to do that anymore, as a lot of the crucial information had now been released. This is actually almost a counter-argument to my point about the positive idea of sparking discussions, as all the discussion was had at once and they couldn't really start to build a tension by dropping things like hints and teasers. This in turn could actually have also had a second negative impact, as there may even have been a small loss of interest in the game if some players already felt they knew how the game was going to pan out, and so the element of surprise and going on a journey through the game was lost, leading to some players just not even bothering to buy it. There is no way of knowing whether that was the case, but it is certainly a possibility that leaks on a large scale can lead to a negative impact on sales. Again, going back to the Star Wars Battlefront 2 leak, not only did EA no doubt lose a certain number of sales due to the bad press and negative impression based off the leaks, but they also had to remove some of the microtransactional elements that they initially wanted to implement, meaning they were losing out on money in two aspects, whether they were considered moral or not. For my next thought, imagine you are a developer or writer, or just generally involved in some way with the creation of a new game. You pour out a lot of passion, time and effort into a project, and you and the team have a perfect plan set out for when to release teasers, trailers, social media posts, etc. However, you wake up one morning and find out that a leak has just occurred revealing secret information about your game to the public way earlier than expected. Maybe it relates to a section of the game that you haven't even finished yet, and so may not be the best looking piece of gameplay or story. You would instantly feel like all the hard planning you had done has now gone out of the window. This would in turn create a huge drop in morale throughout the whole development team, which may even have an impact on the general love and passion put into the game from that point onwards. This would obviously be different depending on the severity of the leak. Little small things like early development screenshots wouldn't really have much of an impact, as you know what you are looking at is an early impression of the game. However, things like story elements or new game mechanics would be a bit more of a hit for the morale of the team. This, in extreme cases, could then result in a poorer quality of the final product. Finally, I wanted to go back on what I said during the positive impact discussion, where I mentioned how feedback based on video game leaks could actually be considered a positive and a negative. I'm not just talking financially, but you could consider that making a video game is a bit like making a piece of art. Imagine if you told Vincent van Gogh halfway through a painting that you weren't a fan of the use of blue, and he started to question it and ended up creating a painting with a different colour. You could consider that the people creating the video game should make the game to the exact spec that they envision in their heads, and all of the feedback and judgment should be discussed after they have released it. This is less of a cut and dry negative or positive, as it's more up to your view of the art that is video game creation. After all, everyone sees video games, and indeed art, differently, so that final point is up to interpretation. So let's take a look at whether overall video game leaks should be considered generally a positive or a negative thing. You could say that it appears at first glance to be an overall positive for the consumer, but an overall negative for the development team and publishers. However, the fact that it negatively impacts the development process can more often than not lead to an overall negative due to spoiled storylines, less enjoyment of the game, and less passion put into the project overall due to lower morale. And so it's hardly a surprise that this is the outcome, but I would personally say that the negatives far outweigh the positives, and that's my personal verdict. Maybe you have a different opinion and a good argument to back it up, or maybe you have some thoughts that I never came across during the creation of this video. If so, that's what the comment section is for. Let me know what you think. Also, please remember that liking the video is a very small gesture from you that has a massive impact on my channel. So if you wouldn't mind before you click away, if you were to leave a like, it would be massively appreciated. If this video interested you, make sure you subscribe to see more like this in the future, and most importantly, my name is Joey Bay. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time.